Hi, everybody. Tim Hughes here. I'm the CEO and co-founder of DLA Ignite. Today, I've got Damien Kopp with me, and we're going to be talking about something that I've not heard of before, which is technopolitics, which is the fact that everything in the world seems to be thrown up in the air and it hasn't landed yet, and it doesn't seem to be landing anywhere. And we need to take into account the fact that there is just this massive mix up of everything. So anyway, Damien, welcome. Where can people find you?
Thank you, Tim. You can find me on LinkedIn, Damien Kopp, and I'm sure you'll be able to find me very easily.
Absolutely. You're pretty active anyway on LinkedIn, aren't you? So Damien, what is technopolitics?
So it's really the intersection of technology, power, and ideology. And it's not new by any means. I think people have been using technology to gain control, to impose control in many aspects. I think of a few strategic, critical technologies like semiconductors, for example, that have been key, have been actually highlighted in a few books, including Chip War, for example. And I think it's important now because there's a massive concentration of power of how and who. So who owns the technology and controls it today, and in particular, strategic technology like artificial intelligence. And looking at the value chain of this technology, you'll realize how concentrated and resource intensive and concentrated it is in the hands of a few. And it's beyond institution, it's beyond supranational institutions, it's beyond government. In fact, these companies are bigger in terms of market capitalization than the GDP of certain countries. When you take the Apple, the Meta, and the Nvidia and others, I think Nvidia just broke a record yesterday at $4 trillion for
Did it? Oh, I did. I
a
missed
few
that.
seconds, and then they went back down below four. But that is the scale we're talking about. And a company has only one mandate, mainly, is to make profit for their shareholders. It's not a government, right? They have no social, social mandate. And considering the sheer size of their their presence globally as well is I think it begs the question as to what is their intent beyond just growing and I guess taking more profit, and what is the ultimate agenda beyond just I guess pure competition and capitalism, and that gets into a very interesting space, which is then some are driving with ideology as well. This ideology is being now baked in some of the component of this AI value chain I mentioned. So what's technopolitics? Sorry, I should have just kind of wrap it up before I jump in. I'm too excited. Really, how politics, power, ideology intersect with technology. That's really the short answer.
Because I know that when uh, President Trump announced the tariffs, I
Yeah.
know a number of companies went and spoke to a friend of mine, and they said we need to look at putting our IT equipment in the cloud, and we need to look at other options other than America. And the answer was, well, you don't have any other options.
Yeah, so exactly. I think that's the challenge. I think everybody's start to realize is I mentioned the concentration of power. You take the again, if I get back to the example of the AI value chain, because AI is so I guess is such a big topic these days. If you look at the from the water and energy that's needed, and you big companies like Microsoft, Meta, making to own the source of power to power their data centers. They own data centers themselves. They own and they're trying to design their own chips. But today, the lithography technology is effectively one company in the world, ASML, based in the Netherlands, and the only company that can design a super the latest generation of chips used for AI, so the GPUs, is TSMC in Taiwan. So you have really a handful of companies who are able to master this technology, and then you have the big hyperscalers and the big tech companies, big platforms who are trying, you can see, to verticalize, right? So I mentioned nuclear power, chip design, data centers, submarine cables, satellites, and all the way to AI models. And if you look at now the fact that people consume news and information through social media and through some of these platforms that are amplifying a number of news, usually emotionally charged, usually negative because it brings more clicks, more engagement.
Yep.
And knowing that none of these tech, and especially the Gen AI model, are neutral, then they are driving an agenda. And I'm not about the conspiracy theory here, but it's a fact. Every LLM created, from Grok, who actually was, I think, just in the news, I think, out of this morning, because it was promoting some Nazi ideology,
Yep.
is naturally, if people use this technology to produce content, or they use it to consume content or summarize content, that becomes really a problem, because whoever owns the infrastructure end to end owns the narrative. So you can have a way to you can be a politician trying to explain your agenda. If you don't control that, the way your information is going to be conveyed and diffused, then it's going to be really hard for you to convey your your message, and your message could be changed.
Yes. So you wrote an article about it recently where you talked about 14 risk families,
Hmm.
which if I rattle them off quickly, there's trade control and sanctions. There's critical mineral choke points, like cobalt or semiconductor access to it, data sovereignty, laws like GDPR, guardrails. So there's different AI laws in Europe. Um, Cyber warfare, currency payments, conflict. So you talk about the fact that there was a cable cut under the in Europe.
Yep.
Talent mobility. You've got Meta basically saying that they're going to pay people with AI skills 100 million to come and join them. Supply chain issues, source code transfers, and political instability. So that just to rattle them off.
Yeah, I so they are both levers from a government perspective to assert control and protect their own citizens and companies and business. But they are also, if you look at it from a corporate perspective, which is the angle I'm trying to take, because I'm working with clients to try to understand the risk, and the risk is about these dependencies, and it's always very specific to the kind of business a company is in, the kind of market they operate in, and the kind of infrastructure they have. So in a way, you got to read this risk in terms of which one applies to what part of my business and what is my exposure level. Now, what are the mitigations? Because we talked about, okay, well, there's no other option, right? There are options at different levels of the stack I mentioned. So you look at the stack from infrastructure, networks, communication, data layer, AI model, and enterprise application layer at the top. For each of these layers, there are different choke points. There are different levers you may be exposed to, but there are also solutions. It could be encrypt your data and keep your encryption key with you, as opposed as using the hyperscaler ones. Why? Because the Cloud Act authorized, under certain condition, the U.S. administration to access data on any U.S. servers, regardless of where they sit in the world. So you may be, look, I'm in Singapore. I'm using one of the big hyperscaler. My data is safe because the residency is compliant because the data is actually sit next to me. Well, it's not, because you could be exposed to this, right? And even the funny part, or the more complex part, is if it applies in Europe, the Cloud Act contradicts directly the GDPR regulation, because data is not supposed to leave the country, but the Cloud Act is mandating the data to be extracted out. So his point is, a very simple way is encrypt your data and keep the key with you so nobody else has it. So at least you have control here. Now, there are also open source solutions, alternative to some of the big software suites out there. And you can see Denmark, some municipalities in Denmark and Germany have announced that they were effectively moving away from Microsoft Office and Azure to look at open source alternative, for example. Now, can everybody do that? Probably not. But again, they saw it for their business and their mandate as a risk. So there are solutions. None of them are perfect. I take usually a risk-based approach and a very practical approach. If there's no alternative, you get to look at some of the workarounds or mitigation in the meantime until you can plan for better.
So from a tech leader perspective, what sort of things that we need to be looking at? Because we need to be looking at IP rights, data localization, different jurisdictions. What do we need to do as leaders?
So I think first of all is I think the awareness part, and I think I can tell now, having talked to a number of industry leaders across different markets, there's a very different level of awareness, and I think a sense of risk and exposure depending on the jurisdiction they operate in. So where I'm at here in Singapore and across Asia, I don't get a strong feel that sovereignty is a big deal, and I know in Europe it's actually the number one topic everybody's going to talk about, right? And so there's a different kind of level of urgency that is pretty clear. So awareness, certainly the first one, and second is really be able to do a stress test your digital infrastructure and look at your current exposure, and then you start planning for some of the quick wins I mentioned. It could be turn a switch. On Salesforce has a Shield Force feature to encrypt your data at rest. Well, is it even turned on? Don't know, right? So I'm coming up with checklists, very practical checklists to look at. Have you done X, Y, and Z? And you start mitigating and putting in place your mitigations. They are obviously longer term activities. It could be take some of your data, your systems on premise, the most sensitive one, or look at a sovereign cloud option. And by sovereign cloud, I don't mean the same guys telling now it's sovereign. I'm saying a true sovereign option. So again, it's not going to be perfect, and especially on the short to mid term, because there are very few options in that sense, but there are some that could help start the decoupling and limit some exposure on some critical aspects of the business.
And what can we do from an operational point of view in terms of looking at the risks and the disruption and things like that?
I look at it as it's really scenario planning, right? In a way, so in most major organizations, you'll have a chief risk officer, and you'll be running through business continuity planning scenarios, right? This is no different. I think it's a new lens on understanding that this is now a risk that should be in the risk officer's radar. And interestingly, because tech has a tendency to be a bit on the side, it may not be perceived as such. So what I'm trying to do is bring it up and say, look, it's actually now an executive level, a board level kind of conversation. You have exposure on your data and your digital infrastructure because you are not completely strategically autonomous, right? So how you build that strategic autonomy is by understanding where you can decouple. So scenario planning, stress test your organization and your tech stack to understand with these choke pokes, the choke
Points.
Yes, sorry, and try to list them out and start to kind of activate mitigations as you go. And the stress test approach, I think, is helpful because it's practical and it will go straight into what matters for the business. So again, make it practical, make it risk driven, and there's no perfect answer to that, but there will be a very specific approach, I think, for each business, industry, sector, and markets.
And build in resilience, I assume.
Exactly. So the point here is to build resilience for the business, because you don't want to be surprised, right? You have companies who can be completely disrupted from day one because suddenly they cannot they cannot buy a service or use a SaaS platform that's now cutting borders, or because they pay in USD, suddenly they've been exposed because they've been using Swift by paying in USD, and they had nothing to do even with the tech being American or whatever. But there are these choke points that you need to really identify and be able to be that again you can mitigate immediately, I think.
And is there any other future technopolitics trends that we need to be looking out for?
I touched upon it a bit earlier, but I think maybe the most threatening part in a way, and not trying to sound the alarm too much here, but I think the information flow, and I think the narrative around I guess how the information is being consumed today, I think is the major risk if you look at it from a society, from a country perspective, but also from a corporate narrative perspective. So your marketing campaign, your reputation building is all going to be affected by how well you're able to communicate to your audience. And if this flow of information is being constantly manipulated, we've seen companies literally being with malicious actor trying to
Well, we had
modify
a supermarket here in the UK, Marks and
Mm.
Spencers,
Yep.
that's been out for a month,
Right.
6, maybe even 2 months, because of a hack.
And yeah, so it comes as a and there's the the cybersecurity component to it, stealing data, exposing data or systems, but there's also just the exploitation of the narrative and trying to either blackmail or modify the message a company is trying to get across. So
Well,
it can be extremely
they've worked out that it was an internal person.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is and I'm mentioning that because that's a risk that you have to mitigate.
Yeah.
And at one point, the hackers wrote to the board of Marks and Spencers and sent them all emails saying, "You do realize that your company is at risk and you need to pay this ransom."
Yeah, that's terrible. Terrible. So I guess back to your question about what to look for. I think understanding and being aware that the information as it flows today is being unfortunately quite it's quite hard to have that true sense of transparency and trust, and people are losing trust in the traditional media and institution, and now you rely on social media that are not any better because they do amplify again emotionally charged negative sentiment, which is not great. So if it's not great for I guess society and for individuals and for businesses, it's a stabilization issue in many economies that we live in, and certainly for a business, it can be really hard to recover and regain control.
So do you think we can alleviate some of this risk with by using insurance?
Oh, that's a great point. If they're able to cover for the risk, yeah, I don't know how much of a
Because I
premium.
understand that I understand that you now can you can now insure against these ransomware attacks, and the insurance
To a
will pay
point,
out
yes.
and pay the
Yep.
ransom.
Yep. It is true, I think, to a point, but I think the moment, and maybe back to some of my earlier points, it's a legal lever being used by an official government or institution. It will be likely excluded from any of these of the terms because it's not an accident. It's actually a legal enforcement of something that was foreseeable. Again, the Cloud Act is legal in that sense, right? The GDPR is legal, so I don't think you'd be covered against that. And that's more actually the sense of my overall my message is, obviously there still be cyber attacks and people with malicious intent. I think the challenge is the moving landscape of the policies and different jurisdictions flexing muscles using legal power to influence certain decisions and technology. And that is hard because it's legal, but you're going to be the first one impacted, although you're on the other side of the world. And that's what I'm trying to kind of get a better read on and advise my clients on.
Damien, thank you so much for coming on and talking about Technopolitics. It's a fascinating subject. If people wanted to find out more information, where could they find it?
So I do have a publication called concentric.co, concentric with two Ks.
So that's KONCENTRIK.co.
.co, and you can always contact me again on LinkedIn, and you will see my newsletter from there as well.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Damien, thank you so much for coming on. It's not a subject I've come across before, so I really appreciate you coming on. And
Thank you, Tim, for having me. Super appreciate it. Thank you so much.